There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that evil rarely arrives wearing a monstrous face. It arrives through ordinary people, through fathers and mothers, scholars and soldiers, neighbors and friends. It arrives quietly, often convinced of its own righteousness. We prefer to imagine evil as something alien to us, something separate, a corruption that belongs to tyrants, murderers, and history's villains. But the frightening truth is that evil is not merely the absence of goodness. It is often goodness distorted, fragmented, wounded, or possessed by unconscious forces that remain unseen even to the person committing the act. The word evil itself carries an ancient weight. In Old English, evil referred to something harmful, morally wrong, or destructive. But many traditions understood evil not as a supernatural force alone, but as blindness. In Greek thought, particularly in Socrates, wrongdoing was tied to ignorance. One acts wrongly because one does not truly know oneself or the good. Christianity would later deepen this idea, portraying evil as separation from divine order, a turning away from wholeness. And perhaps this is where the real horror begins. Because if evil were only committed by obvious monsters, the world would be simpler, easier. We could identify the danger immediately. However, history reveals something far more disturbing. Ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty under the right conditions. Carl Jung understood this with terrifying clarity. He once wrote, "The healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers." This does not excuse evil, but it explains something essential about its roots. Jung believed that every human being possesses what he called the shadow, the hidden, rejected, unconscious aspects of the personality. Everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves accumulates there: rage, envy, cowardice, cruelty, lust for power, resentment, weakness. It is a part of you. It is a part of all of us. The problem is not that the shadow exists. The problem is when we believe it does not, because what remains unconscious does not disappear. It grows in darkness. It waits. And eventually it seeks expression. This is why some of the most dangerous people are not those who admit their darkness, but those convinced of their purity. The individual who believes himself entirely good becomes incapable of recognizing evil within his own actions. He projects it outward, he hunts it in others, and in doing so he becomes possessed by the very thing he condemns. We see this pattern everywhere throughout history. For instance, during the Salem witch trials, deeply religious communities convinced themselves they were protecting society from evil while participating in hysteria and cruelty. During the French Revolution, calls for liberty and justice descended into mass executions. The Soviet purges, the Cultural Revolution, the atrocities of Nazi Germany, all were justified by visions of moral necessity, national salvation, or ideological purity. Hannah Arendt famously called this the banality of evil after observing Adolf Eichmann during his trial. She expected a monster and instead found a disturbingly ordinary bureaucrat, a man who seemed less demonic than spiritually asleep, not radically evil in appearance, simply disconnected from conscience, reflection, and responsibility. This is difficult for us to accept because we want evil to feel dramatic and obvious. However, much of it emerges through conformity, through obedience, through fear, through the desperate desire to belong. Dostoevsky understood this deeply. In The Brothers Karamazov, he writes, "Above all, don't lie to yourself." Such a simple sentence, yet perhaps one of the most important warnings ever written. Because self-deception is the beginning of moral collapse. One tells oneself that cruelty is necessary, that humiliation is deserved, that violence serves a greater cause. Little by little, conscience is silenced. The psyche adapts, and eventually what once felt unthinkable becomes ordinary. This is why evil rarely feels evil from the inside. In essence, the psyche possesses an astonishing ability to justify itself. Jung observed that people will do almost anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. To confront the shadow is painful because it destroys the fantasy that we are entirely innocent. It reveals contradictions we would rather avoid. We are loving, yet capable of hatred. We seek justice, yet enjoy revenge. We desire peace, yet are drawn toward destruction. And nowhere is this more visible than in groups. An individual alone may hesitate before committing harm, But within a crowd, conscience dissolves. Responsibility fragments. One no longer acts as oneself, but as part of a collective force. Nietzsche warned of this when he wrote, "Madness is rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, nations, and ages, it is the rule." The crowd offers relief from individuality, relief from doubt, relief from moral burden. One simply follows. And in following, one becomes capable of horrors one could never imagine alone. However, evil does not only exist in grand historical events. It appears in ordinary life in quieter forms. It exists in the parent who humiliates a child because they themselves were humiliated, in the friend who betrays out of envy, in the spouse who manipulates out of fear of abandonment, in the worker who participates in corruption because everyone else does. These acts may appear small compared to history's atrocities, yet psychologically they emerge from the same root: unconscious suffering seeking expression. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's close collaborator, observed that when people refuse to confront inner pain consciously, it tends to spill outward destructively. What is not transformed inwardly becomes fate externally. This is why unhealed wounds are dangerous, not because suffering automatically creates evil, but because denied suffering often mutates into resentment. And resentment is one of the most corrosive psychological forces imaginable. Nietzsche saw this clearly in his analysis of ressentiment, the hidden bitterness that slowly transforms pain into vengeance disguised as morality. The resentful person does not merely suffer, he wants others to suffer too. And yet there is another paradox here. The capacity for evil is inseparable from the capacity for freedom. A being incapable of wrongdoing would also be incapable of genuine virtue. Morality only exists where choice exists. This is why many myths and religious traditions portray humanity as suspended between opposites: heaven and hell, light and darkness, order and chaos. The human soul is not fixed, it is a battleground. In Christian theology, Satan was once an angel. In Greek myth, heroes frequently become tyrants through pride. In fairy tales, the shadow often appears disguised as a helper, friend, or even lover. The tarot card of the devil rarely depicts evil as brute violence alone, it symbolizes unconscious bondage, chains people do not realize they are wearing. This is the terrifying thing about evil. It often feels meaningful while one is inside it. Here we arrive at Jung's most uncomfortable insight. The goal is not to destroy the shadow, but to integrate it consciously. This sounds dangerous until one understands what he meant. To integrate the shadow does not mean acting out cruelty. It means recognizing one's capacity for it, acknowledging aggression, envy, selfishness, domination, and resentment honestly rather than pretending they do not exist, because the person aware of his darkness is far less likely to become possessed by it unconsciously. Shakespeare understood this long before modern psychology. In Macbeth, evil does not erupt instantly. It unfolds gradually through temptation, ambition, rationalization, and inner corruption. Macbeth is not born a monster. He becomes one step by step, each compromise making the next easier. This is why self-knowledge is not luxury, it is necessity. To know oneself deeply is not merely therapeutic, it is ethical, because the unconscious person is dangerous, not only to others, but to themselves. They become vulnerable to possession by ideology, rage, fear, envy, and collective madness. However, there is hope within this darkness. The same psyche capable of evil is also capable of transformation. Jung believed that confronting the shadow honestly could lead to individuation, the painful process of becoming whole. Not perfect, whole. And wholeness is different from innocence. Wholeness includes contradiction. It accepts that light and darkness coexist within the human soul. It abandons fantasies of purity and embraces conscious responsibility instead. This is the difficult path: to look inward without flinching, to resist self-deception, to carry suffering without transmitting it, to recognize the monster within and refuse to feed it. Few things are harder, but perhaps this is the real dividing line between good and evil, not the absence of darkness, but whether one becomes conscious of it before it begins to rule the soul.